we'll get started and start moving through. Father God, thank you for your love for us. Thank you that you are in control of the circumstances, even when we're not exactly sure what they are or exactly where they're going. Thank you for Jesus. Thank you for this Passion Week. Thank you for Maundy Thursday and just all the things that Jesus did in his life here on earth and the events that we'll be celebrating over the next 3 days. Thank you for your plan. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to be shepherds of sheep in the pen that you entrust to each one of us. And just my prayer that the time we spend together tonight will be profitable for your kingdom. And I ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. So thanks for joining us. Just a couple of oddities. We always appreciate it if you stay muted. I've got about 25, 30 minute or so chat with a few PowerPointy kind of things. I know you guys have been dying to see another PowerPoint. My plan is to just kind of go through that. Down at the bottom of your screen, you should have the chat button, and we encourage you to use that to shoot some questions out, that kind of stuff. I've asked Soshi if she sees a really interesting question on something that I'm just working through to just barge right in and interrupt me, so I answer it then. I don't know that I'm skilled enough to watch the chat screen, my screen, and the PowerPoint and talk all at the same time. So feel free to ask those questions. Afterwards, I hope we'll have plenty of time to answer any questions you all might have and to be able to maybe go a little bit deeper into some of the information and stuff that we'll be sharing with you. So just by way of introduction, I want Alex, if you would, wave to everybody. Alex Rivero, one of our EFCA West team members, responsible for our All Peoples initiatives. Soshi Kashon is coming to us live from Minneapolis. She's our administrator, and she is the chief technician and whatnot for this particular call. And then if you haven't met him yet, I want to give our district superintendent, Tim Jacobs, the opportunity to say hello and maybe share a couple of words before we dive into the presentation tonight. Tim?
Thanks, Bob. It's great to have so many of you. I mean, 20 people here on this call. And so thank you so much. One of the things that hits me, and it's a privilege to be with you. I'm Tim Jacobs. I'm the district superintendent for EFCA West. I had been a senior pastor, lead pastor for many years. Just recently stepped out of a 12-year run at a fantastic church in the West Valley of Phoenix in Arizona called Compass Church. Several of our elders are on the call. Pete Gilbert and Richard Bren and Jim Fisher are all on the call. And those just tremendous men of God. And I'll tell you, I really want to say to you, those of you serving in an elder capacity, I just want to say thank you. You are so much the backbone of the church. And I can't tell you in my 12 years as a lead pastor of Compass, and then in my 5 years before when I planted a church, how many decisions I made that were the right decisions because we had good, robust discussion and thought that and input from our team of elders, and how many decisions I did not make that would have been really dumb had my elders not given me counsel and we had a chance to talk through things. You guys are unsung heroes in many ways. You don't get the platform time. You don't want the platform time, but your leadership it radiates and throughout the church. And so I really do want to say thank you for what you do. Our polity in our evangelical free church really does kind of provide for the roles that you guys play, and it really does help strengthen our leadership. And really that's one of the things that we want to do as EFCA West. One of our main deliverables is to strengthen the leadership community, and that just doesn't include lead pastors or even associate pastors, but that's also our elders and lay leaders as well. So thank you for being a part of this. And I also just want to give kudos to Bob Osborne. This was his brainchild, and really I wish, the one thing I wish coming into this is that more churches took advantage of Bob's wisdom and took advantage of the fact that they're a part of our evangelical free tribe to be able to utilize him for elder training, for church health assessments, and really helping to strengthen our churches. So anyways, thank you so much for being here. It's great to have you guys with us.
Yeah, thanks, Tim, for being on the call. And, it'll be a real treat for you Tim, once we get transportation going again in this country, for Tim to be able to get out and meet some of you at your churches. I know that's been one of his priorities. It was ground to a sudden halt here because of this COVID-19 thing. I'm going to get the screen share function going here. See if I can't pull this off. Few little taps on my computer, and there we are. Did it work? There we go. I love to get that thumbs up. One of the things I also want to add to what Tim talked about in terms of our mission to strengthen the church's leadership community is one thing specifically for elders is that we want to be on your contact list. We want you to have EFCA West on your contact list. One of the things that is always sad to me is, especially in some of our smaller churches, when something happens with a pastor, gets sick, or some event occurs, that elders oftentimes kind of sit there and wonder, what do I do now? And so we just want to offer just the idea that we should be on that emergency contact list for you, where we live for this stuff. It's what we do. It's what our passion is. And we're excited to help with you. The topic tonight is leading well as a board member in a time of crisis. And there's just a couple of things that I want to mention just as we begin, just by way of changing some things. And hopefully this screen isn't frozen on me. It looks like it might be. So here we go again. I had this happen. There we go. Our starting place. I guess my computer's getting a little persnickety with me, but I want to kind of set the stage. EFCA has so many different churches of different sizes, and EFCA West serves churches in 7 states. And so there's all kinds of different contexts of ministries that our churches and our church leaders find themselves in. And so one of the things I always like to say whenever I share with a group of churches is just to address the reality that every church is in fact different. They're different in terms of their geography, the communities they serve, their history, their tolerances for, just all kinds of things make churches different. In fact, one of the things that oftentimes our English language churches don't know about is the number of Spanish and Tagalog and just, Mandarin, Cantonese congregations that we serve. And so every church is different. They all bring their own unique culture. And so something that works at one church may not work at another one. And every leadership team is different. Leadership teams are comprised of individuals. And so, in fact, oftentimes if your board has changes in personnel and you've been there for a while, you know that every time you change personnel, the personality of your board changes some. And so, what may have worked really well last year may not work well this year because things are different. And the bottom line for that is that one size does not fit all. And so as I share some things with you today, just remember that everything I say may not work for you. And what we always encourage you to do is to listen to things, try to mind the principles that might apply, and then figure out what's going to work in your ministry context. The worst thing in the world to do is to try to copy what somebody else does and then discover that it in fact does not work in your ministry context. One of the other things that's real important to know is that size matters when it comes to leadership. There are significant differences in leading a church that would be considered large and one that would be considered smaller. We like to say normal size because most churches are normal sized and not very, very large. And the difference is depends upon the size, the complexity, and the number of staff that are working in a church. Those things impact what boards do. And so in general, in a smaller church, the board members tend to be very hands-on. You may be an elder and you may also be, the student ministries person. You may be an elder, you may be the second, teaching pastor. There's just much more hands-on ministry going on among elders in a smaller church. And I'll use the word elders generally because that's the word I typically, that's my role at my church. But when I say that, I'm referring to board members, different churches in EFCA. call their leadership teams different things. Larger churches tend to be more staff-led, and that's just the nature of the beast. They're larger, they're moving faster, they have much more moving parts, they're more complex, and they can't wait for a monthly or twice a month board meeting to make decisions. All of our churches are congregational. That means certain things are reserved to the congregation. And so you need to kind of identify where you are on that spectrum. Am I a large church? In which case we're probably what I like to say staff-led, elder-governed or board-governed and congregational. Or are we a smaller church where we're more elders are hands-on, actively engaged in all aspects of ministry? So it's important at the start for us to figure out where we fit on that continuum so that we can figure out if things that we talk about a little bit later are actually going to apply to us. Leading during a time of crisis is different from leading during normal operations. The normal rules that our church boards have operated by, many of them just don't work during a time of crisis. And we are, in fact, in a time of crisis. There are two main reasons why this is so for church boards. The first one is this idea of increased tempo. Things just move faster. And so we as elders, we're not able to ponder decisions. We need to make decisions faster, and we need to be able to make decisions with less data certainty. We can't research things as fast because we need to move quickly. You may think of it kind of this way. You know, many times in normal operations, a board is thinking along the levels of, just kind of use a different example. It's like, I'm going to take a trip. I'm going to travel north on Interstate 15. You know, that's the direction. That's where we're moving north on Interstate 15. A crisis would be you're moving north on Interstate 15 and a deer runs in front of your car, right? Those are two completely different planning, completely different strategies that we have to use. So the increase in tempo is something that makes leading in a crisis significantly different. Another aspect is that the predictability of events is decreased because things move fast. If you look at things on a graph, instead of, you know, that steady climb, you end up with this kind of stuff. And it's hard to predict what's going to happen next. You know, you think back into mid-February, did we think we would be doing Easter virtually? You know, did we think that all of our churches were going to be closed down and no one was going to be, you know, meeting together in our building? And the problem we face as elders, as board members in an environment during a time, in a leadership environment during a time of crisis, is that the increased tempo coupled with the decreased predictability, it generally quickly overwhelms the normal decision-making processes that we have. We just can't keep up. And so it's important to recognize that it's different, and where oftentimes we get in trouble as board members is if we're trying during a crisis to exercise the same systems and structures and tempos and decision-making processes that we have been doing during normal operations. I like to start many a leadership and crisis leadership conversation with a quote from Napoleon. I know it doesn't seem sometimes like it fits, but I don't know a much better quote that defines what the leader's role is during a time of crisis. And you know, basically it's on your screen there. The leader's job is to define reality and then offer hope. And I think that's an important role for board members in a church. In addition to the lead pastor and any staff that are platformed on a regular basis, as we talk with members, now we talk you know, distant by phone or Zoom or you know, some other thing, not so much in person. We need to have the same expression of what the reality is of the situation in which we're facing. And you know, it's like, what is the reality today? And I would suggest the reality today is that things are going to get worse before they get better as things stand today. Another reality that you might want to think about is that when we're not going to return to the old normal. When things get to what we would call normal again, it's going to be a new normal. We will have learned things. We will have changed because of the months of this experience that we've gone through, and that our churches have gone through, and that our congregants have gone through. And so it's just important for us to, as we go through it, to define the reality. And it's okay if the reality changes. We're not politicians, we're not Republicans and Democrats yelling at each other. We're leaders in our churches. We're shepherds of our congregation. If we learn something new tomorrow that changes the reality, we just need to redefine the reality and not worry about, oh, I have to be consistent with what I said yesterday. Define the reality as it is. And it's probably not going to be as nice as many of our congregants want it to be. Big question is, how fast can we get back together? And the answer is, we'll probably not get back together for a long time. It's probably going to be a long time. So we just want to remember our job as leaders is to define reality and then offer hope to the congregation. So what's the congregation? The people that aren't burdened with leadership. Leaders are usually cut from a different cloth than those that actually move with the masses. Or we're not better, we're just different. We see things differently. We engage with crises differently. So what's happening in the people who would normally be in the pews? What are they looking for from their leaders? And I'd like to suggest 6 things for us to think about. What might the people in our congregation, even though they're viewing us on a screen or listening to us on the phone, what are they looking for? The first thing they're looking for is for us to be calm. For us to be relaxed, for us to not be a voice that hypes things up. The difference between us and media is we're not trying to sell anything. We don't have to sell advertising. We don't have to generate lots of clicks by leaving people in breathless anticipation. Let's just be calm. It's very calming for people to have a leader define reality and then offer hope. That's where that fits in again. The second thing I'd like to suggest is that we focus on clarity and truth, saying things clearly. For instance, if someone asks you, when do you think we're going to be able to meet together again as a church? And even if they add the word like we used to, if we say, well, just, we're hoping we can do that really soon, that's not clear. That's just very ambiguous. And so what we want to do instead of that is we want to say something that actually has some level of clarity, like, we don't know, which is true, right? It's the truth. We don't know, but we're making plans as though we won't be meeting until, let's say, Father's Day, just to pick a date. And that way people know that we're making long-term plans and that we don't really know, but we've given a clear answer to their question. Clarity and truth is going to be our friend when we can communicate with each other and communicate with the congregation. We already mentioned hope. People need to see that there is something positive at the other end, that church isn't obliterated forever. There will be a time when we begin to get back together again. We'll talk a little bit later about what that might look like to kind of help us plan through this. One of the things that calms congregations and really any crowd during a crisis are familiar voices. They want to see familiar voices coming from familiar faces. And so this is probably, as we think leaders, this is probably not the time to bombard our congregation with 15 or 20 different faces, all saying something, especially new faces. Let people see the familiar faces. So, at my church, if we wanted to have, one of our elders speak, of the 6 of us, 3 of us are very familiar faces, 3 are not. Who would we showcase? One of the 3 familiar faces. We typically at our church are saying as often as we can, we want our lead pastor to talk to the church as a whole. We want our children's pastor to talk to the children's ministry people. Again, these are familiar faces to those audiences. That has a calming influence on it. A sense of normalcy is something else that gives us comfort. And notice I didn't say return to normalcy because it's not normal. That's just not going to happen for a while. But just this sense of normalcy. One of the ways to do that is with rhythm. A lot of churches are finding out just how hard it is to actually live stream something and are beginning to, record their services on Thursday or Friday. And then they hold off putting them online until, say, 9 o'clock when their first service is. And then they show it again at 11 o'clock. Well, why would we do that? Well, it gives people a sense of normalcy, because you go to church at 9 or you go to church at 11. And so those kinds of things, we may think, not a whole lot of them, some may think it's a little bit tricky, but it actually helps to calm people down because it feels normal. And then the last thing I just kind of mentioned there is singular messaging. Too many people talking, let's just say things get really bad at your church for, whatever the myriad of reasons could be in the next few months. You don't want to have a lot of spokespersons talking about what's going on. You want to defer to one or maybe two voices. I typically recommend assuming, usually a pastor has pretty good stage presence. They're usually a great spokesperson. Oftentimes a board chairman, has the poise and the ability to do some public speaking. If it's not your chairman, maybe you have another one if you feel that, a board member needs to speak to something. But just make sure that we're giving one message. And the best way to do that is if we limit the number of spokespersons that we have. So what do we do now? I'm elder at my church, and I serve as the chairman of the board at the church that my wife and I attend. And it's like, what should we be doing? During a time of crisis, it's like the public screams for somebody to do something, which is why, in the political world, people jump on and, officials start declaring we're going to do this and do that. And oftentimes we have no idea if it's actually going to, accomplish anything. But it does feel comforting to people that somebody is doing something. It feels like someone's in charge. What should board members do during this time? I really believe one of the most important things for us to do is to slow the operational tempo. Try to control that frantic pace of change that's going on, the tempo of operations. Things begin to happen quickly and we want to slow it down. A couple of ways to slow it down that I think are important. One of the first things that we do when we have to do church differently is we think of all kinds of new things that we could do. We've got more people watching our broadcast of our service than ever come to church. How can we reach all those people? Let's do this, let's do this, let's do this. It's like, let's resist that urge to jump in and create a whole lot of new programs, because what that does is it increases your operational tempo. It makes things go faster, and the enemy of sound decision making is speed. That's our enemy. We don't want to create things we can't sustain. We don't want to wear out our people. We don't want to create ministries so that people who should be sheltering at home are out on the streets doing things. So we need to give thoughts to stuff. So if we can avoid increasing workload, like this, especially if you have a church with a lot of staff, one of the things I think the board needs to consider is that this may well not be the time to dump a whole bunch of new initiatives on those staff members. We may want them to just concentrate on one or two things that are probably relational in nature as opposed to programmatic in nature, and allow them to reach out and touch and minister to people instead of creating new programs. The other thing I think is really important for us is to be careful about setting increased expectations, not just on the board, but on our congregations. There are a number of really creative things that I've seen churches do. Several churches have done every morning a short broadcast. The pastor does a short study or something along those lines. And, they put it out every morning, 6 o'clock, 8 o'clock, whatever. And I think that is amazing and a wonderful thing to do. The issue is, how do we market that? And so one of the things we as leaders need to remember is that if we say, here's something that you need to listen to every morning, right? We create that expectation that we expect you to be listening to that. We oftentimes fail to take into account the two-income household that is both working from home and now has 3 or 4 children running around all day long. It might be the last thing they need is that pressure to listen to one more podcast, or to stand in one more line, or to click on one more video. So it's one thing to offer them. It's another thing to create that expectation that during this time, people are going to do more and more and more things as we offer more opportunities for people to engage. And so it's just recognizing the difference between providing an opportunity and creating an expectation. And it's generally the way that we say it, the way we communicate it. I encourage us to give ourselves grace. Give grace to ourselves, give grace to other people. We're not going to be able to do everything. We're not going to be able to minister to every need. We're not going to be able to touch every person that hurts. And we have to decide that's okay. We'll do the best we can under the circumstances. And what doesn't happen will be okay. Our web presentation of church service may not be perfect. That's okay. We may not have the best camera angle. That's okay. Our staff may try something and it won't work. That's okay. You know, let's give grace to one another instead of becoming judgmental as we try to run through these things. I'm a big fan of board members actually assessing what's going on in the church. Looking for areas of accountability, paying attention to results and all that stuff. This might be a good time to dial that back a little bit as people are, kind of running around trying to figure out what's going to work, how can we operate in this new environment. Early on, one of my suggestions was, I think the first week we published this, was to empower pastors to lead. Oftentimes this is, this is not necessarily what we do in regular operations. I'm a big fan of having elders discuss things, especially new initiatives and stuff like that amongst themselves with pastors. Not to micromanage, but to just be part of the team and to maybe have some ideas that are worth doing. But during a time of crisis, lead pastors especially, and even staff in larger churches, they need to be able to be nimble. They need to be able to act quickly. And they literally don't have time to consult with boards. And so, again, this is a time where what we want to do is to delegate the things of today and the things in the next few weeks, and then let's as board members plan for the next month and the month after that. For us to begin to focus more on creating direction and guidance for where we're going downstream and not paying as much attention to the day-to-day things. Especially in trying to direct things. Staff typically, now if you have staff that isn't good, you have a different problem, okay? But I'm assuming that you have competent staff who understand the direction and what their job is. This is a time to really empower them to do what you need to do to accomplish your ministry. Make sure their ministry is clear, and then empower them to do it while board members worry about what's going to be further downstream. Communication between meetings, I think, is another thing for us to think about. At my church, our elders meet once a month. But during this season, we have added so far, we have added one additional Zoom meeting. We do our meetings on Zoom, but it's a different meeting. It's a meeting where we just meet to discuss and become up to date. So right now we're on an every other week schedule. We're about every other Thursday we'll have a call. It may take a half hour, it may take an hour or hour and a half, depending on what the conversation is, but that's just to keep us on the same page, to make sure that we're all seeing and hearing the same things, to communicate. In fact, when we announce our non-meeting meeting, our mid-month meeting, one of the things we put in it is the purpose of this meeting is discussion, not decision. We want to avoid, if at all possible, having to bring this to a decision. Let's save our decision-making meetings for the meeting that we typically do the first Sunday of the month, and that just keeps us involved. Okay, when staff are being nimble and they're doing stuff, we need to know what's going on, but we don't necessarily need to direct it as tightly during a time of crisis. And then the other idea there is to focus on the next operational period. Those that know me know that my first career was in policing, and the last half of that career, I spent a lot of time in emergency management of major events, the typical Southern California flood, fire, riots, earthquakes, all that kind of stuff, mudslides, you name it, we had it. But one of the things people often don't know is that, each of those incidents has someone that's the incident commander, and that was my role. And what we typically did is we had 12-hour shifts. where you had that role. And of course, there's an hour that we would meet before and an hour afterwards to, kind of exchange information. But one of the things people were woefully aware of was really what I did during my 12-hour shift. Somehow I always got the night shift. I'm not sure how that works. But I would come on at 5:30 or 5 o'clock, get briefed by the day shift person, and I would assume command at 6 p.m. And then I would make sure that, and I obviously had a team, we'd make sure that the plan for what we were going to do that was developed during the day shift, that we were implementing that. And what I spent most of my time on was creating the plan for the next shift that was going to start at 6 in the morning. And so, as the incident manager, I'm not watching all the details. I'm planning the next shift. And I think that's an excellent role for those of us who are board members right now, is to be focused on the next shift instead of supervising. Because if we're not focused on the next shift, typically no one is. And then that next shift is going to be a surprise to us. And so it's a bit of a discipline. We're usually used to watching things in the shorter term, but that's just another area where crisis leadership is a little bit different than normal operations. So what's on the horizon? What might we as leaders expect to be happening now? Just want to put out like 5 things here that I think we need to have on our radar. It may be different at your church, but these are kind of general things. Most of the churches that we've talked to so far haven't seen significant decreases, perhaps a minor decrease in giving. We need to remember that last Sunday was the first Sunday of a month, which is usually the healthiest month for most of the churches that we serve. And, a lot of our people that are out of work, they got that last paycheck, but now they're out of work. And so, many of us are assuming that church finances, nonprofits, they're all going to begin to suffer financially and perhaps experience significant declines in income. And then the second aspect of that is that when the economy begins to pick up again and people get jobs, that we're not going to bounce back as fast. Typically, nonprofits and churches are a little bit slow in feeling the initial impact, and we're a little bit slow in recovering. That seems to be what happens historically. And so we need to be planning and thinking and talking about, what are we going to do with significantly less money? And when I say significantly in terms of cash flow, I'm talking, having an idea of what would we do if we go 10, 20, 30, maybe even 40%. And let's talk about those. So it's not a big surprise. We'll talk in a minute about why it's important for us to be having these conversations soon. We need to think about congregants out of work and their financial needs. One of our churches, I'll mention Bullhead City, Arizona by name. We're talking with their pastor, and the day that Nevada, right across the river from Bullhead City, is Laughlin, Nevada. The day that Nevada announced that the casinos and restaurants were closed, 8,000 people in tiny Bullhead City lost their jobs. This is a big hit for a working class community. And so, they need to have some long-term plans. So we need to think about how is that going to affect our congregation. Serious community needs, again, that particular church is going to have huge opportunities to minister in their community, in the name of Christ, as the people in that town are out of work and out of food and begin to suffer some things. Most of us in our churches haven't experienced a whole lot of sickness and death, but stand by. Chances are that's going to continue. A lot of the estimates that I've been seeing indicate that peaks in many of our areas are going to occur next week, not this week, maybe late this week. And so we'll begin to see more and more people that we know that are sick, and then we'll probably experience some deaths. How are we as a church going to minister to grieving and hurting hospitalized people over the next 2-3 months when we can't visit them? What are we going to do? It's an area for us to plan. And then the last thing I mentioned here is this idea of long-term restrictions on gatherings. Many in your congregations will ask the question, when can we meet again? And I think it's important for us as leaders to recognize that, as suddenly as the meeting restrictions came about, they're not going to go away that quickly. What we'll probably see is a ramping up process where when the the curve is flattened and new cases are coming in slower, that we'll begin to see smaller gatherings will be approved. Let's say, governor or local officials will say, maybe groups of 10 that don't have anyone who's sick can meet. And then, maybe a couple of weeks later, it'll be 50. And, then we'll see things going. It's important for us to keep in mind that, sports leagues they're talking about not doing anything until well into the fall. And so that's what they're thinking about, restrictions on public gatherings. So we need to think about it that way as well. If we have a ramping up of the ability for people to meet together in groups, perhaps the first thing for us to consider, potentially ramping up again in person would be maybe our small groups ministry. What would that look like? How might we go about that? What are the rules that they need to, the protocols they may need to have in order to make those things a reality? And so anyway, that's just some of the things that we think are on the horizon in terms of programming. As it relates to staff, well, what did I do here? Did I go backwards? No, I may have done two things here. There we go. I pushed the button twice. I think one of the things we really need to do is focus on caring for staff. Our staff need to be effective in the long haul. So, I mentioned earlier, if we can lower expectations for what they do, we have to remember they're under house arrest. If they have kids, their kids are running around at home. They've got the same problems that the rest of us do. They can't buy groceries. They're, all that stuff they're facing as well. And so this is a time for us as board members to experience or to demonstrate some grace, give them support. Don't make them ask permission for every little thing. I think an important message for us to actually say is that we want them to care for their families first. Care for your family first. Chris Brown from North Coast Church was on one of our early Wednesday webinars a week ago yesterday, and he talked about coming to this realization that perhaps one of the best things that they could do with their staff is to kind of just talk about this as a forced sabbatical. Yes, there's work that needs to be done, but maybe this is a time that you as staff members can focus on personal, spiritual, your own family, and even your own professional growth. And then one of the things that I think we as elders can do that would be really, really positive would be to check up on staff and to pray for them. Actually pray for them on the phone or on the Zoom chat. Let them know that we're there. I did these a little bit out of order here. Let me go back one slide here. Why is it important to plan for the horizon, over the horizon? We want to generate options for the likely future events before they come to pass. That's why I mentioned if we talk about financial things, I encourage churches to plan, to have some idea of what you're going to do if you see 10, 20, 30, 40% cuts. Each of those would be different. What are you going to do? How are we going to handle those? So that we have some idea. And the reason we plan early is it gets the emotions out of that last minute decision. We don't feel like we have a gun to our head or, we have to make a decision tomorrow. We can actually talk about things and research things because we're doing them in advance. That gives us clarity of thought. I always like to say a rushed decision is a bad decision. And we want to think about things as best we can and be prepared for stuff. And then we always need to remember that plans are what we intend to do. They're typically not what we actually do because the situation changes by the time, between the time we planned it and we actually run into it. But the situation at the time, even though it determines what we're actually going to do, what we do is informed by the plans we already made. So that planning is really, really important because it gives us an idea, it gives us a direction of where we're going to go and what we might need to do in order to address the need that we have. And then last slide here, and we'll address some questions. Look forward to that. It's like, how can you as elders, as board members connect with EFCA West? One of the things that we've noticed is we have much stronger connection with pastors and church staff than we do with elders. And we would really like that to not be true. We'd like to be connected with the entire leadership community of the churches. And so there are 5 things that I have here, and then one other thing to talk about. Our webpage is actually embedded in the EFCA National website. And so if you try to get there from the national site, it's a little bit funky. And so we just tell people to do the shorthand. Go to efcawest.org, and it'll navigate through the EFC website, and it'll get you to our page. And you can click on that and figure out, you know, who to contact and what we do, and see our smiling faces, and get a little bit of information about the services that we provide. The zip line is our little e-publication we put out typically the first of every month. We also use that list for a lot of our other mailings and you know, blast information that we send out for things that are new. And so we would love to have elders subscribe to that. We have a lot of stuff that we think is interesting for leaders. I always think it's good for board members to know what their pastors are learning from EFCA. I write an article every month called Something to Talk About, which is designed to spur conversation among board members and staff about issues that perhaps we don't always talk about unless somebody prompts us to do it. I'd love to have you be able to peruse that. The way to get there is you go to that EFCA West webpage and just scroll to the far bottom right, click on subscribe, put your email address in the pop-up that comes there, and bingo, there you are. You'll start getting it the first of every month. We have a Facebook site. If you do Facebook, go to EFCA West, and ta-da, there we are. We also have a YouTube channel. If you get on YouTube, type in EFCA West, ta-da, there you are. You'll see some videos that we put up, some of the prior meetings that we've had in the last few weeks on Zoom, and some of the Facebook things that we put out. And so we encourage you to look there. You can always reach us at EFCA West by email. It's hard to imagine that email is now like old-fashioned communication, but it still works really, really good. General inquiries, go to efcawest@efca.org. Sochi Kashon gets those, and we'll parcel them out to the right person if she isn't the person that answers them herself. And all of the district staff, excuse me, we're first name dot last name at efca.org. And so you can get a hold of any of us that way. I also want to call your attention to something we just started with this crisis called the EFCA West Financial Support Ministry. What we're trying to do is to connect churches that might be able to provide some financial support to EFCA churches that desperately need financial support. One of the things that we anticipate will happen is that our smaller churches, and especially our churches that minister to ethnic and immigrant congregations, are likely to be those churches that are the hardest hit. And many of them, if they don't get support, we're fearful they could well go under. And we would like for that to not happen. One of the things, I mean, the reason we exist is to glorify God by multiplying transformational churches among all people, not watching them die. And so we are encouraging churches that might be able to support, might be willing to support a church, to just let me know by email. I'm coordinating this program. And just let me know that you'd be willing to help somebody. And then churches that have needs to contact me as well. And all I do is play matchmaker between churches that might, and individuals as well, that might be willing to provide some assistance, and churches that need assistance. We're not touching any of the money. It's just transferred between either the individual and the church, or the church to another church. One of the things we're trying to do is build relationship. If you have questions for that, let me know. And I just, you know, just by way of a plug, you know, I just got to say it. The best example, I think, of the love of Christ in us is not that we stockpile for ourselves, but that we share with others. We share to meet other people's needs. And so even as we're looking to take care of ourselves, is there a way that we might be able to sacrifice for other churches that may have needs? And so I appreciate you listening to this thing. I haven't looked for any questions. I'm going to turn off this thing. I have one more slide there that's just my email address. Feel free to contact me if you have any questions about anything. I'd love to serve you. Bob.Osborne with an E. It's not spelled like Ozzy Osbourne. OSBORNE at EFCA.org. And with that, I'll turn this off and see how we got. We got some chats going on there, which I haven't looked at yet. And I'd like to also open it up to any of you that may have some questions, things that you want to talk about. let's not all be bashful at once. Maybe we should unmute everybody, all at once and see who jumps in. Anybody with a question about anything, comment, concern? Anything we could help you with?
Bob, I guess you said earlier, you talked about slowing the operational tempo, but I then also, though, I want to make sure that because you also talked about communication. So slowing the operational tempo does not mean that we slow the communication tempo. So can you talk to us about the importance of regular communication to our churches right now?
Oh yeah, I mean we need to open up a lot of different channels. One of the things that churches are learning a lot these days is that different people communicate through different channels, and so that's one reason we've got Facebook, we've got web stuff, we've got emails we send, we've got YouTube. What we're seeing at churches is well, one of the things we did was it earlier? Yeah, it was earlier this week. We had chats like this with children's ministry staff, and we had chats like this with student ministry staff. And one of the things we discovered from them and really encourage them to continue doing is children's ministry people are reaching out to children, to parents, and to their workers, and the same with the student ministry staff. And it's not something, a lead pastor doesn't have to do that, assuming, there's a staff member to do that. It's just important to reach out to the people that we would normally reach out to in whatever channel we can to stay relationally connected. What's going to hold churches together, we believe, in the future when we begin to come back together again, isn't going to be the fact that we kept a bunch of programs, or we did a super duper service on Sunday. We really believe it's going to be that we reached out to people during the week. We made contact with them. We asked them how they're doing. We touch them as they're sheltered in place in their homes. A difficult group for many churches in many areas is going to be the senior citizens. And I have to laugh. I've shared with many people that, when they talk about the at-risk populations, I kind of look around and go, they're actually talking about me. It kind of feels bizarre to me to say that. It's like, dang, they're talking to me. But the older senior citizens, many of them, they aren't really savvy with technology, especially if their kids have moved away or grown up, or, they didn't have kids, and, those kinds of things. And we need to figure out ways to reach out to them, not to bombard them with things, but to reach out to them. And then us amongst leaders, we still need to communicate. I would suggest that, for the most part, depending on, if you don't already have at least the every other week communication between pastor and your board or elders, that you try to embrace that. I think that the change is rapid enough. Y'all want to be on the same page. Y'all want to be on the same page. So slowing the tempo refers to events, not the frequency of talking to people.
Right. And I think one of the things, Bob, and we've been holding these webinars, that's a theme that's come out too, is how many of you talk about children's ministry, student ministry, and other ministry, how much they're leaning into other people that they wouldn't have leaned into before. And so as elders, it's looking around, because we always should be looking for leaders anyway, who's kind of rising to the surface. But especially now, one of our churches was talking about how the children's ministry was leaning into the parents to even create content for devotionals and stuff like that. Like, they come up with some of the things, and then if they're, obviously they vet them, but they can pass them around through email links or whatever to other parents, or even having a parent video their kid praying, over dinner, or praying, before they go to bed for this coronavirus thing. And then they would put those things together and show them in the church service. So they're finding new ways of figuring all that out. And I think so it's looking for those, leaning into those other people and looking for those new opportunities.
Right.
And then absolutely,
and the response is overwhelming from people who get those calls. Overwhelmingly positive, joyous even. They are so thankful that somebody reached out to them.
Well, and I think it was Dave Collins. I think it was your church where we talked a few weeks ago about how you guys were calling down your roster, and you didn't even get through the A's before. You just were making phone calls. And I would start. I think we said start with your older folks and just call them. And that goes back to Bob. I love what Bob, when you said err on the side of relational decisions as opposed to programmatic. So if you're calling down the road, just checking up on the older folks. Hey, how you doing? Wow, that's fantastic.
Yeah, it's important to stay connected to people. I mean, we're in the people business. We're in the disciple making business, and disciple making is people, not programs. So we really need to reach out and touch people. Any other things?
This is Kent Schubert from Albuquerque.
I can't.
I got the feedback right away when we did our first Zoom meeting that, wow, it's really fun to come to a 3-hour Zoom meeting when I was just on Zoom all day long for my job working from home. So we're trying 1 hour a week meetings. We just started that this month, but and we had one of those. But I don't know if anyone else has tried that, but I'm trying to figure out how to organize them to handle everything you would normally handle. Because you have kind of a rhythm to a 2 or 3 hour meeting, which gets broken up by doing it in 1 hour segments. And I haven't figured that out totally yet. But
what you're talking about is really true. That everybody who, I've been living on Zoom, and I go home. I go home. Here I am at the EFCA West Church Health World headquarters in my office at home. I walk down the hall after a day in this office, and I'm more tired than I used to be. So breaking it down into smaller chats is actually worthwhile. That's one reason we work really, really hard to keep anything that we do to 1 hour. It's just hard to stay up. And you had a follow-up question, I believe?
Well, the other one was on making the phone calls. I had an experience. We had kind of went through our stuff to figure out who was connected in groups and make sure those groups were contacting people. And then we had a list of maybe 120 or so people that we couldn't tell if they were connected anywhere else other than just we had their phone number or their email address. And then we split those up amongst the elders and the staff and started making calls. And the one thing that happened to me on one of them was what would that have been? It would have been like 15 men and 1 woman making calls. And when you call an elderly woman and she has no idea who you are, that's really not a very good way to do it. So we need to be recruiting some other women to help us make those calls. We had them in some cases, but on that list of folks that had no other connections, we didn't think of it. And that didn't work very well.
Yeah, it's interesting. The student ministries people, when they're talking about using technology like Zoom and stuff like that, and I never thought about this, but one of the participants said, one of the first things they discovered is that the junior high girls don't want to do a Zoom meeting in their bedroom, where everybody's going to see their bedroom. They don't, and it's like I'd never thought of that. My kids are in their 30s, so. That was a long time ago. I even thought about stuff, and we didn't have Zoom. But those are the types of things that oftentimes we don't notice. And, if we're all a group of men, oftentimes we don't notice things that are of concern to women in the congregation. So, yeah, by all means, include them. Kent, in terms of making the meeting shorter and easier to get through stuff, I mean, I don't know this for a fact for your church, but one of the things I find working with churches is oftentimes their elder or board meeting agendas are larded with things that they spend hours talking about that could have been just put down in 2 paragraphs in writing. Just read this and move on. It's just, anything that's merely the exchange of information, we can write down. And we can talk about other things, or you can, maybe divide it up. On the first week, we're going to talk about this month's finances. The second week, we're going to talk about member care. There are ways to do it, but, I don't know if it's a quick fix for you, but that shaved about an hour off our regular meetings at my church. We just did it in our regular meetings, said all these things that we just talk about, just put them in a short report. We get more information now than we used to get. And it takes us much less time. I can read that report, at my home before I go to the meeting, and we just say, anybody have a question about the report? Very seldom we do, and we knock out an hour's worth of work.
I'm sure we can get better at. We've implemented those kind of things already, but it's still easy to unless we self-police, it's real easy to get into long conversations.
Yeah, and anything that's not germane to the task at hand, we can put off. Again, we're trying to slow down the operational tempo so we can pay attention to the things we need to pay attention to right now. You know, that question, what's important now? And perhaps all the usual stuff isn't. One other thing, you know, Tim was mentioning, several of you were talking about or nodding heads about making phone calls and stuff. This might be a great season to identify potential elders that we know nothing about. And just kind of look around in terms of whatever it is that we do and ask ourselves, who is ministering, who is shepherding the congregation on their own naturally, that we might want to think about as, you know, like, you know, obviously there's other vetting processes, but, you know, it's like, let's see who rises up during this time of crisis and demonstrates the quality of being a shepherd of the flock, whatever portion of the flock they have. And we might find ourselves some good potential elders that, because they're not otherwise flashy, might have just gone right under the radar. So that might be something else we can do. Any other questions or inputs or comments? Soshi, are there some administrative things that we need to say before we hang up and move on?
I would just say, Bob, that we'll send a follow-up email to you all that'll have a link to this presentation on YouTube that you can look at. Please feel free to share this. And Bob, a question was asked earlier, can we get the presentation? We'll be able to provide a link to the presentation as well, the not just the Zoom, but the PowerPoint.
Yeah,
as well.
we'll get that up to you.
And I assume people would be able to take that and they could present that too to their staffs.
Oh yeah.
Cool. Great.
I mean, the idea, you know, we had no thought that you know, any church would have every one of their elders on this meeting. We figured we might get a combination of elders, you know, an individual elder here and there, and pastors who are going to, you know, perhaps some of them a little bit suspicious about, like, what are they going to tell my elders? Yeah, so this will be on the screen or available to you, you know, print it, discuss it in your meetings, all that kind of stuff. And again, you know, I would be happy to have one of these Zoom meetings with your elders and talk about these kinds of things if that's going to be beneficial. At the end of the day, our purpose is to still, you know, minister to leaders, like the leadership community in our churches. The way we do it, the platform is different, but the purpose is the same. And so we're open to do whatever we can to help you out. Anything I missed, Soshi? Am I good to go? All right, I got the thumbs up from Soshi. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope this is beneficial to you and will prove to be beneficial down the road. If I can help you with anything, by all means, best way to get a hold of me is by email. And we'll see you soon, I hope. Take care. God bless you all.